The year was 1968. The Cold War had turned the oceans into a silent, terrified chessboard. Beneath the waves, nuclear-powered predators stalked each other in a game of cat and mouse where a single mistake could end civilization. But on March 8, 1968, the game changed. Somewhere in the vast, freezing emptiness of the North Pacific Ocean, the Soviet submarine K-129 missed its scheduled radio check-in. K-129 was a Gulf II class strategic ballistic missile submarine, a 2,000-ton beast armed with 3 R-21 nuclear missiles, each capable of vaporizing an American city. It carried a crew of 98 men codebooks and the deepest secrets of the Soviet Navy. And it had simply vanished. Panic erupted in Moscow. The Soviet Navy launched one of the largest search and rescue operations in maritime history. For 2 months, flotillas of Soviet destroyers, submarines, and reconnaissance aircraft scoured the surface of the Pacific. They were desperate. They were frantic. They knew that a lost nuclear submarine was not just a tragedy. It was a vulnerability. If the Americans found it first, the balance of power would shift overnight. But the Pacific Ocean is 63 million square miles of nothingness. The Soviet fleet searched day and night, battling storms and exhaustion, but their technology was simply not up to the task. Their sonar was deaf to the deep ocean. Their navigation was imprecise. After 60 days of futile hunting, the Soviet High Command made a heartbreaking decision. They declared K-129 lost with all hands. They abandoned the search. They assumed that the ocean was too big, the water was too deep, and the grave of their sailors would remain a secret forever. But they were wrong. They had underestimated the United States Navy. While the Soviet admirals were blindly scanning the surface with binoculars, the Americans were listening to the heartbeat of the planet. The U.S. Navy had secretly deployed a system called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. It was a vast classified network of hydrophones laid across the ocean floor, designed to track Soviet submarines by the noise of their engines. When K-129 imploded, the sound of its hull, crushing under the immense pressure of the deep, traveled for thousands of miles. It was a singular, violent acoustic event. American technicians at secret listening posts heard it. They triangulated the data. They didn't just know that a sub had sunk. They knew exactly where it was. The Soviets had searched millions of square miles. The Americans were looking at a specific dot on a map, 500 miles northwest of Hawaii. To confirm the kill, the U.S. Navy sent the USS Halibut, a special operations submarine equipped with remote-controlled cameras. The Halibut slipped out of Pearl Harbor and descended into the abyss. It took weeks of searching, prowling the seabed in total darkness. But finally, the strobe lights of the Halibut's cameras illuminated a field of debris. And there it was, the K-129. It was lying at a depth of 16,500 feet, more than 3 miles down. The pressure at that depth is 7,000 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a human body into a pulp instantly. The sub had broken apart, but the missile silos were intact. The conning tower was there. Inside that steel tomb were the nuclear warheads, the cryptographic machines, and the codebooks that the Soviets used to communicate with their fleet. It was the intelligence coup of the century. It was a treasure chest sitting at the bottom of the world. When the photos reached the White House, President Richard Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger were stunned. The opportunity was limitless. If they could recover the codebooks, they could read Soviet naval communications in real time. They would know where every Soviet submarine was, what their orders were, and when they planned to attack. But the engineering challenge was impossible. No one had ever raised a 2,000-ton object from 3 miles deep. At that depth, steel cables snap under their own weight. The water pressure makes hydraulic systems fail. The sheer physics of the operation were beyond anything humanity had ever attempted. The Navy engineers said it couldn't be done. They suggested just dropping a claw to grab a few pieces. But the CIA had a different idea. They didn't want a few pieces. They wanted the whole submarine. The CIA officially took over the operation, codenaming it Project Azorian. They needed a ship, but not just any ship. They needed a massive futuristic vessel capable of lowering a 3-mile-long steel pipe string into the ocean, grabbing a submarine and lifting it up, all while remaining perfectly stationary in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And they had to do it right under the noses of the Russians. Soviet spy trawlers were constantly patrolling the Pacific. If they saw a U.S. Navy crane ship parked over the crash site, they would know exactly what was happening and might even attack. The CIA needed a cover story. They needed a lie so big, so audacious, and so expensive that the Soviets would never question it. They needed a distraction. Enter Howard Hughes, the eccentric billionaire, the aviator, the mad genius. Howard Hughes was the Elon Musk of the 1970s, but even more reclusive and mysterious. The CIA approached Hughes with a script. He would announce to the world that he was entering the mining business. He claimed that the ocean floor was covered in manganese nodules, potato-sized rocks, rich in valuable metals. He was going to build a massive revolutionary ship to harvest these rocks. It was the perfect cover. Only a crazy billionaire like Hughes would spend hundreds of millions of dollars on a high-risk, deep-sea mining venture. The media ate it up. The public believed it. And most importantly, the Soviet intelligence analysts believed it. They looked at the plans for the ship and thought, it's just another capitalist trying to get rich. With the cover story in place, construction began on the Hughes Glomar Explorer. It was a beast of a ship, 18 feet long, packed with technology that was decades ahead of its time. It had a massive derrick tower in the center, but the real secret was hidden underneath. The ship had a moon pool, a giant opening in the bottom of the hull with sliding doors. Inside this cavernous belly hung the capture vehicle, a massive mechanical claw nicknamed Clementine. Clementine was the size of a house equipped with powerful hydraulic fingers designed to wrap around the hull of the Soviet submarine and crush into the seabed to secure a grip. The plan was to lower Clementine on thousands of sections of high-strength steel pipe, grab the sub, and pull it up into the moon pool. Once inside, the doors would close, and the scientists could dissect the prize in total secrecy, hidden from Soviet spy satellites and passing ships. The engineering required was mind-boggling. To keep the ship steady while lifting a 2,000-ton load from 3 miles down, the engineers invented dynamic positioning. The Glomar Explorer had thrusters all along its hull, controlled by a computer, something unheard of in the early 70s. The computer would use sonar transponders on the ocean floor to calculate the ship's position and fire the thrusters automatically to counteract the wind and waves. If the ship moved even a few feet, the 3-mile-long pipe string would snap like a twig, sending the claw and the submarine plunging back into the abyss. It was like trying to lower a spider web from the top of the Empire State Building to pick up a paperclip on the sidewalk in a hurricane. The cost of the project ballooned to $800 million, equivalent to nearly $4 billion today. It was one of the most expensive intelligence operations in history, rivaling the Apollo moon landings in complexity and cost. Thousands of workers built the ship and the claw, but only a handful knew the true mission. To everyone else, they were just building a mining ship for a crazy billionaire. The secrecy was absolute. The CIA even orchestrated a fake press tour, showing off fake mining equipment to journalists. They created a fake market for manganese nodules. They committed to the lie with absolute dedication. By 1974, the Glomar Explorer was ready. It sailed from Long Beach, California, looking like a spaceship floating on the water. The crew, a mix of roughneck oil drillers and undercover CIA operatives, prepared for the mission of a lifetime. They were heading to the crash site of K-129. They were about to attempt the greatest grave robbery in history. But as they arrived at the target coordinates, the radar screen lit up. A Soviet naval tugboat was approaching. Then a Soviet missile range instrumentation ship appeared on the horizon. The Russians were watching. The CIA captain held his breath. If the Soviets realized that the mining ship was actually hovering directly over the grave of their lost submarine, this wouldn't be a salvage mission anymore. It would be an act of war. The Cold War was about to get very hot, 3 miles beneath the surface. July 4, 1974, Independence Day. But for the crew of the Hughes Glomar Explorer, there were no fireworks. There was only the endless crushing gray of the Pacific Ocean and the silent tension of a mission that could start World War III. The ship was holding its position directly over the wreck of the K-129. The computers were firing the thrusters, fighting the currents to keep the vessel perfectly still. In the center of the ship, the massive derrick began to turn. The moon pool doors opened, revealing the dark abyss below. It was time. Section by section, the heavy steel pipe was screwed together. The massive claw Clementine began its long, lonely descent into the dark. It moved slowly, just a few feet per minute. At this speed, it would take days for the claw to reach the bottom. But the Glomar Explorer was not alone. Just as the operation began, a blip appeared on the radar. It was a Soviet naval tugboat, the SB-10. The CIA agents on board froze. Had the cover been blown? Had the Kremlin figured out that the mining ship was actually a grave robber? The Soviet tug plowed through the waves, coming dangerously close. Its captain was curious. He saw this massive, strange American ship sitting in the middle of nowhere, with pipes going down into the water. He circled the Glomar Explorer. He watched with binoculars. On the deck of the American ship, the crew acted casual. They waved. They pretended to be bored miners. But inside the control room, men were sweating over the sonar screens, praying that the Soviets wouldn't notice the sensors deployed on the ocean floor. The Soviet tugboat signaled, "What are you doing?" The Glomar Explorer signaled back, "Conducting ocean mining tests." The Soviet captain lingered for days. He even launched a helicopter to fly over the American ship, taking photos of the deck. The CIA operatives hid below decks, terrified that a stray face or a piece of equipment would give away the game. If the Soviet captain had known that directly beneath his keel an American claw was reaching for his country's lost nuclear missiles, he would have rammed the Glomar instantly. But the lie held. Howard Hughes's reputation as a crazy billionaire saved them. The Soviet captain eventually shrugged, likely thinking, "Just crazy Americans playing with rocks," and sailed away. The crew exhaled. The heist was still on. Down in the darkness, Clementine finally reached the target. The operators in the control room watched the video feed from the underwater cameras. The grainy black and white images confirmed it. The K-129 was lying on its side, a broken steel corpse half buried in the silt. The operator carefully manipulated the controls. The giant hydraulic fingers of the claw opened. They positioned the machine over the submarine. With a shudder that was felt all the way up on the surface ship, the claw descended. The fingers dug into the seabed. The jaws closed around the Soviet hull. "We have capture." Now came the hardest part, the lift. Raising 2,000 tons of waterlogged steel from 3 miles down is a fight against physics. As the winches began to turn, the pipe string groaned under the strain. The Glomar Explorer sank lower in the water. Slowly, agonizingly, the submarine began to rise. Inch by inch, foot by foot. For days, the crew worked in shifts watching the tension gauges. Every foot the sub rose was a victory. They pulled it up past 10,000 feet, then 8,000, then 5,000. They were pulling a ghost back to the world of the living. But then tragedy struck. The ocean is a cruel mistress, and she does not give up her dead easily. When the submarine was only 3,000 feet from the surface, so close that the crew could almost feel victory, A sharp, deafening bang echoed through the ship's hull. The ship shuddered violently. Alarms screamed in the control room. The operators looked at the monitors in horror. One of the massive steel fingers on the claw, made brittle by the extreme cold and pressure, had snapped. The structural integrity of the lift failed. The K-129, weakened by the explosion that sank it 6 years ago, could not support its own weight without the full support of the claw. As the Americans watched on the cameras, the submarine broke in half. The rear section, the part containing the nuclear missiles and the code books, slipped out of the claw's grasp. It tilted backward and began to fall. It tumbled back down into the darkness, crashing into the ocean floor with a force that shattered it into pieces. The prize was gone. The crew was devastated. Years of planning, $800 million, the risk of war, all for nothing. Not quite. The claw still held the front section of the submarine. It was only about 38 feet long, a fraction of the total vessel. But they had no choice. They couldn't go back down. They hauled the remaining piece up. The moon pool doors opened, and the mangled wreckage of the K-129's nose was pulled inside the belly of the Glomar Explorer. The doors slammed shut. The water was pumped out. CIA agents in hazmat suits entered the moon pool to inspect what they had caught. It wasn't the intelligence bonanza they had hoped for. The missiles were gone. The encryption machines were likely in the section that fell back. But as they cut through the twisted steel of the Soviet hull, they found something else. Something that silenced the room. Inside the wreckage were the bodies of 6 Soviet sailors. They had been preserved by the freezing cold and high pressure of the deep ocean. These were not enemies anymore. They were sailors who had died serving their country. In a moment of profound humanity, amidst the cold calculations of espionage, the CIA decided to give these men a proper burial. They didn't dump them back into the sea like garbage. They crafted a metal container. They prepared a formal military service. On September 4, 1974, on the deck of a spy ship in the middle of the Pacific, American intelligence officers stood at attention. The Soviet flag was raised alongside the American flag. The Soviet national anthem was played. A chaplain read a prayer in both English and Russian. "We commend to the deep these officers and men of the Soviet Navy." The container was gently slid into the ocean. The CIA filmed the entire ceremony in color. It was a secret gesture of respect between adversaries. They had tried to steal the machine, but they honored the men. However, the mission wasn't over. The Glomar Explorer returned to port with its partial catch. The CIA analyzed every scrap of metal, every document found in the nose section. They reportedly found 2 nuclear torpedoes, which provided valuable insight into Soviet warhead design. But the big prize, the ballistic missiles and the cryptographic keys, was still sitting on the ocean floor. The CIA immediately began planning Project Matador, a second mission to go back and get the rest. They were ready to spend another $1 billion. They were ready to deceive the world again. But there was one thing the CIA couldn't control: the press. Back in the United States, a burglary had occurred at the offices of Howard Hughes. Thieves had stolen secret documents connecting Hughes to the CIA and the Glomar Explorer. The story was leaked. Journalists started asking questions. The New York Times was about to run the story. The cover was blown. The Soviet Union woke up one morning to read in the American newspapers that their lost submarine had been found lifted and dissected by the very enemy they had been watching through binoculars. In March 1975, the Los Angeles Times broke the story. The headline screamed across the world, "U.S. reported after Soviet sub." The secret was out. Project Azorian, the most expensive and audacious intelligence operation of the Cold War, was no longer a shadow mission. It was front-page news. In Moscow, the Kremlin was furious. The Soviet admirals were humiliated. They realized that for weeks an American ship had been hovering over their lost submarine, picking through its bones like a vulture. They realized that while they had given up, the Americans had spent $800 million just to prove they could do the impossible. But here was the irony: the Soviet Union couldn't complain. To complain would be to admit that K-129 was indeed their submarine, and worse, that they had lost it and failed to find it. It would be an admission of incompetence. So publicly, they remained silent. They ground their teeth and watched as the world marveled at American engineering. Back in Washington, the CIA was besieged by journalists demanding the truth. Did you steal the submarine? Did you find the missiles? What did you find? The CIA was in a bind. If they said yes, they risked a diplomatic crisis or even war with the Soviet Union. If they said no, they would be lying, and the press already had the proof. So they invented a third option, a masterstroke of legal judo that is still used by governments today. The CIA issued a statement: "We can neither confirm nor deny the existence of the materials requested." This became known as the Glomar response. It was the ultimate non-answer. It was a way of saying, "We aren't telling you anything, and you can't prove anything." It became a legend in the world of espionage, born from the need to hide a giant metal claw in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So was Project Azorian a failure? Critics argued that spending $800 million to recover only a third of a submarine was a waste. They called it a billion-dollar blunder. But history sees it differently. First, the technology developed for the Glomar Explorer changed the world. To lift the sub-engineers invented heavy-lift dynamic positioning, the ability for a ship to stay perfectly still without anchors. Today, that technology is used by every deep-sea oil rig and drill ship on the planet. The project literally unlocked the resources of the deep ocean for humanity. The cover story of ocean mining eventually became a reality, powered by the very tools built to maintain a lie. Second, the intelligence value was not zero. The recovery of the 2 nuclear torpedoes gave the U.S. Navy critical insights into Soviet warhead technology. But more importantly, the operation was a psychological masterstroke. It proved to the Soviet Union that there was nowhere to hide. If the Americans could reach down 3 miles and pick up a submarine, they could do anything. It forced the Soviets to spend billions upgrading their own security, further draining their crumbling economy. But the most enduring legacy of Project Azorian is not the medal or the money or the secrets. It is the videotape. In 1992, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, CIA Director Robert Gates traveled to Moscow. He met with Russian President Boris Yeltsin. As a gesture of goodwill, Gates handed Yeltsin a tape. It was the footage of the burial at sea. For decades, the families of the K-129 crew had been told that their sons were missing. The Soviet government had erased them. But on that tape, the Russians saw American intelligence officers, their mortal enemies, standing at attention, saluting their fallen sailors, praying for their souls, and committing them to the deep with full military honors. It was a moment that transcended the Cold War. It showed that while governments may fight and spies may steal, there is a brotherhood of the sea that is deeper than politics. The Americans had won the technological battle, but in that moment of respect, they also won the moral victory. Today, the K-129 remains at the bottom of the Pacific, a broken monument to the arms race. But the story of the Glomar Explorer stands as a testament to what is possible when unlimited American money meets unlimited American imagination. They built a ship to steal a giant, and in doing so, they proved that for the United States, even the bottom of the ocean is not out of